So hi, Deborah. It's nice to meet you.
Hi, I'm so excited to meet you. I've known your work
Yeah,
for such a long time, and I know like we've had like little social media exchanges, so it's really nice to actually see your face and meet you. I'm really
yeah,
excited.
totally. Especially because I don't think I've met you at art shows or anything before. So
No,
it's
no, I
great.
don't. I feel like whenever I see people, I always feel like they look familiar, but
Mhm.
I never know if that's in real life or just online. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, a few years
Yeah,
together.
but I don't think we've actually like met and been introduced. So
Mhm. Yeah, so
yeah,
great to meet you.
you too. You too.
Yeah. I have Don's questions up that are really, I thought they were very astute if you want to go ahead with those for the interview.
Yeah, I think that sounds great.
Okay, great. I was just going to take a quick look at them.
Sure.
Um, So I know like it's probably best for the introductions to happen. Did you want to go first and talk about your work and who you are? And
Sure. Um, okay. I always have to think about like how is she going to edit this? So I'm thinking like, how do I start? Right. Yeah. Okay. My name is Debra Scacco, and I'm an interdisciplinary artist based in Los Angeles. And my practice really studies structures of permission. So that is really looking at the lines by which we live and how those lines impact how we move through cities, towns, countries, just how we kind of move through the world as it is structured for us. That can be everything from borders and boundaries, so immigration policy, but also things like redlining and how systems use cartography as both a vehicle and a weapon at times. Environmental structures, so that's really understanding where industry exists and how that exists in relation to the communities that are there or that are displaced because of it. And then, of course, cultural structures in that, like, how do we as cultures move through these sets of lines that have been made for us?
Mhm, mhm. And so I'm Shiva Aliabadi, and my work, I think I have a lot of different series, but they're conceptually tied together to a general core, and that core has a lot to do with displacement and the senses of place and space being very ephemeral and constantly changing. And what that means for one's identity, but also one's body, one's sense of safety in a place and around the objects and the people and the ideas that take up those particular spaces. I think that these ideas definitely stem from my immigrant status, being an immigrant, having come to the US when I was younger, and the difference between the two. And it was kind of a jarring introduction to the culture. So it was kind of uncomfortable. And also it was like, where do you belong? Oh, nowhere. Okay, then there must be a third space for me somewhere. And that third space ended up being a very shifting place. It was not a grounded place. And how do you make a shifting place your home? Because home is traditionally a rooted concept and physical structure. So I also often deal with, as I mentioned, the issue of safety, because I think that in displacement, there was a lot of hostility that I experienced. And I realized that that was bleeding out into my work of what it means when you're trying to set roots, but it's not being allowed for whatever reason. And I think because of the way, the world is functioning now, it's become a very migratory world for so many different reasons. And weather and environment is now going to play into it as well, not just politics. So I think we're going to see even more migrations of people and shifts. So I think this conversation is going to get more complex over the years.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I love the way you talk about the third space. I think that's something that I am also really interested in. And because I'm first generation, so my dad came from Sicily in the late 40s, and then my mom's father came from Southern Italy in the early 20s. And it was both immediately after the war, and there was just nothing there for them, right? And so I think a lot about having grown up in the States with this very rich heritage and not realizing that that was specific to being Italian until I was older, right? So not realizing that that wasn't what other Americans were like until I was older. And then it was when my family moved from New York to a suburb of Atlanta when I was 9 in 1985, that I was like, oh wait, I don't know what being American means. And so I had this moment of kind of understanding that we existed in a third culture that was it because we were existing in the memory of where my family came from and in the present of where we were. And you know, seeing my parents hang on to certain aspects of our heritage that felt important for us to have, but also assimilating so that it was easier for us. And so, and like, so it's like, I'm really interested in this idea of what do you keep and what do you let go of? And also in terms of what you keep, what of that is a memory and what of that is real, right? And, you know, the farther you go from that reality, the more you're working in the memory.
Yes.
So also this idea of like dislocation, a kind of cultural dislocation, because of course, you know, I always say my practice is rooted in the sort of trifecta of time, memory, and place, because those three things don't exist without each other. So it's also that acknowledgement that everything that we exist within and believe in to a degree is a memory of that experience. And so this third space is something I've been really interested in, both because I think there's been a lot of research about how when you live within a third space, you connect more with people who also live in a third space, as opposed to either your first or second space, right? So that is fascinating, but also like, what is the reality of that third space when it's so built on memory and sort of like cultural DNA that may or may not, in my case, it doesn't belong to me because I never lived in Italy, but I have this very deep cultural memory of what that means.
Yes. Yeah. I really like that idea of memory because I think often my family also functioned out of that. And they often say, you know, now that they've been so Americanized, when they go back, it's something else and they feel different from it. They're still a little bit more in tune with the culture because they grew up with it. And I believe they were in their 40s when they moved to the US. I was 6. And for me, I've been noticing recently that if I talk to people from my own culture who came to the US much later, some people in the art world, for example, who are also from Iranian background, when I say something about, oh yeah, our culture is like this, sometimes they'll look at me like, oh no, that's not what it's like. It's actually like this. And I realize that, to use your word, I've been living in a memory of a place that once my parents left, that memory was getting cloudier and changing and more disconnected from the source. And so what I received was an idea of what that is. So that it hit me that even though I call myself Iranian, I actually will never know what that is. I will always be kind of a tourist in a place that's my first home. Also, as an American, I don't feel very rooted or know what that is. And it's because, you know, we came after the hostage crisis. We came in '83. So that was a very difficult time. And people were very hostile because, you know, the media was feeding them some ideas of who we were, and they were telling us to get out, and the whole typical kind of anti-immigrant sentiment. And because of those aggressions and microaggressions, it never felt like a home. It kind of felt like a temporary space that you're constantly floating through, you know, and even though now I'm officially a US citizen, it's kind of like, okay, I'm a citizen of this place that I can't take roots in because I don't know when it's going to say, listen, you got to get out, or we don't want you here, or, you know, so, and that's why a lot of us end up in the major cities, because that's where a lot of immigrants end up, is major cities, so that we can feel like, can we root a little bit? So I really like that idea of memory that you speak of. And I wonder if you have this in your life and work as well. I always get a sense of, it's very foggy is the best word I can come up with, that I can never nail down some meaning or you know, even signifier, if we're going to talk about Derridian terms, you know, of nailing it down and then having it always shift on you and have slippage because you just can't get a sense of it. And, you know, I've been here for decades now and I'm in my 40s, and it's still, if you ask me, who are you? What are you? What's your identity? All I can think of is this third space, you know, based on the memories and based on a foggy sense of something. So it's kind of been devastating that I can't talk about Iran and say, oh, my culture is like this, when I know that there's people sitting next to me that will correct me and say, actually, this didn't happen, or maybe in your family, but in general, and I think that's where a sense of existential crisis, which I tie to a sense of safety, because I think if there's anxiety involved, then you're not feeling safe, and you're always waiting. What's next? Where is next? Even if that where might not necessarily be your zip code, but it might be in your mind and your emotions and in how you speak to people. And I wonder if that resonates with you in some of the things you've been thinking about or your work.
I think it does. I think it does for a lot of different reasons. So my experience, I've been very lucky in my life for sure. And so, you know, I grew up, when I think now, and even as I was starting to get older and just starting to be more aware of these issues of identity and who my family is and what my culture is, and realizing that, you know, it's not necessarily regular for people to have grandparents who don't speak English. It's not regular. Like, we had all of these sort of rhythms and rituals in our family that I just thought that's what everybody was like, because I grew up in an Italian neighborhood in New York, right? So it was just kind of jarring to be like, oh, I don't understand what America is or what it means, right? And so there was that aspect of it that I grew up thinking about. And then, you know, when I was 20, I moved to London and I lived there for 16 years. And that was purely by choice. So it's obviously a radically different situation, right? But then when I was there, I, for a couple of years, didn't have my Italian passport yet. And so I had the experience of having to ask for permission to live my life, right? So I had to go to the home office all the time. And you know, it was like I would get visas. It would be like, you have 8 weeks, you have 12 weeks, you have 4 weeks, whatever. And so every time I had to negotiate this situation of just trying to be where I felt my life was, where I knew my life was, right? So I think negotiating that and then kind of accidentally staying for the bulk of my adult life, and then coming back to the States, but moving to the West Coast. So you know, and coming with an English husband and then negotiating his right to be here and our right to be together as well. I feel like for me that third space is really complicated, because there's like my cultural heritage, my Italian heritage. There's the fact that I was born in America, but have never really identified as American because of my cultural heritage. And then the fact that I spent the bulk of my adult life in another country and then came to the West Coast, and everybody's like, oh, that's so great. Like, that, it's great that you came home. And I just thought, this is not, New York is home, right? So this is nothing like what I know. So then also negotiating this other aspect of being in America, and then being faced with things like, oh, there's no socialized medicine here, so I have to negotiate healthcare. I don't know. I'm a grown up, and I've been, you know, operating as an independent, as a freelancer, independent business, but I don't know how to do that here. So then, because I sound American, and because I you know, there's nothing to say to people that don't know me that I'm not American, not understanding how to do basic things. Where it's like there are just these expectations that, you know, these systems, right? So I often think about the fact that, okay, yes, I have this kind of complex cultural relationship, but I also move through life with a lot of privilege in that I am a white woman, I am educated, and English is my first language, right? So always, as I negotiate these things, I think, if this is difficult for me, imagine what my grandmother went through. Imagine, and of course, like that, people who are experiencing that right now are no different, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot about those relationships and how to, I guess, how to use whatever I have in
Mm-hmm.
order to tell those stories.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that is how we start to break down some of those barriers, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How do you think in your work then, and this question's a little bit more formal, but all of these ideas that you're working with, how they affect which media you use and other formal qualities to kind of convey that, or at least allow them to be proper vehicles for those ideas?
That's a great question, and I will answer that, and then I would love for you to answer that,
Sure.
because that's one of the things I couldn't wait to talk to you about.
Sure.
So I think in terms of formal qualities, you know, the more that my practice went from my own cultural experience to a wider cultural experience, was really using the ideas to identify the materials. So the other thing is I just don't like making decisions. So I feel like a part of my kind of the rigor of my process is also so that the ideas make the decisions for me. So for example, there's a piece that is called The Letting Go, which is based in research that I did at Ellis Island Museum in 2012 that I've been working with ever since. And the piece is about early 20th century marine immigration to the States, right? And that's, again, inspired by my own family history and the fact that even my dad came by boat in 1949, and thinking about the privilege of my own journey as an immigrant, where I could fly back and forth, and I never felt that kind of distance that my family had to feel, right? So like I've been thinking about that for years. And so in creating this piece, there was a quote that a researcher introduced to me by Luciano De Crescenzo that talks about when immigrants would get, specifically immigrants in Naples, when people were leaving to come to the States and they would get on board the boat, one person would hold a ball of yarn and the person on land would hold the end. And you hold and hold and hold until eventually somebody has to let go. And it talks about, you know, seeing these beautiful colors in the sky and looking out and seeing like women holding children and waving handkerchiefs. And that was the first instance of physical distance that I had experienced that explained what that is, like what that feels like, right? Where it's like there's beauty and there's poetry in it, but there's also fear, and there's also an acknowledgement that nothing will be the same. There's also somebody is always being left behind, if that's the case. And maybe you're happy about leaving, maybe you're not, you're probably a combination of both, right? So in thinking about that piece, I just thought, okay, the materials have to tell this story as well. So actually the piece itself is now made of 20,000 feet of marine rope. So I used like a very light marine rope, and it was hand dyed in 7 shades of blue for the 7 blues of the ocean, which also just beautifully aligns with the 7 continents, so it aligns with geography. And then that rope is held in place only by tension with a series of anchors that are made of teak plywood. So teak is like a wood that would have been found on boats at that time. And then the ply is kind of in some ways, it's just like a nod to the fact that this is still happening, right? Because like Ellis Island is a very European white immigrant story, which I really believe is why it's easier for a lot of Americans to digest and sort of accept as like the quote unquote good immigrant narrative, which like that's a whole other conversation about what that means, right? But so there's like, I felt like those materials were important, and that idea of it being held in place only by tension is important because it is what the original quote was talking about.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how, and then there was another piece that I made also based out of that research called Architecture of Separation, which was again only made from these tiny sort of teak anchors and monofilament, which is basically fishing wire, and embroidery thread. And so that was sort of recreating the architecture of a stairway at Ellis Island, which was the last point that immigrants would pass through. And you had 3 options. One was that you were staying in New York City. One was that you're getting on a train and going somewhere else in the States. The other is that you're being deported and you're being sent back, right? Which was absolutely devastating. And there's multiple stories about people committing suicide at that moment because it took everything that they had to get there, right? And now they were being sent back to nothing at best, or extreme danger at worst, right? So so I created that space again, just out of materials that would have been used. And again, thinking about this space as a ghost, like the physical manifestation of that space as a ghost, because that stairway is now just a stairway at the Ellis Island Museum, and thousands of people pass through that stairway every year and have no idea the footsteps that they're following in, right? So those are just a couple of examples of how the materials relate. But I'd love to ask you the same question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I often, some of my works come from a minimalist tradition. That is more kind of an aesthetic interest that kind of comes into the work, and then it marries basically the other concepts that we've been talking about so far. And a lot of the pieces, especially initially when I was making work, were in installation format, where often it was in a space where I'd been invited to create a piece, or I would create it in my studio, present it, and then once it was presented, it was time to clean it up, you know, whether it was pigment or some kind of rubber material that doesn't last very long. You know, they had to be vacuumed up, and things had to be repainted and even bleached to get it back to the former room. And the only thing that existed from them were documents, you know, photography, whether I took it or I hired somebody. And those were, you know, ephemeral forms, ephemeral pieces, because I wanted to create the idea of the art piece without anchoring it. And I noticed I was doing that a lot. There was no anchor. And it was kind of devastating because, you know, you would lose these places that you put your heart and soul in. They would take a while to make sometimes, or, you know, there would be days where it was hours working on a piece and knowing that, oh, in a week or in a couple days, this will be gone. And it was almost like reliving this sense of losing place and losing people and objects that are important to you. And then how do you deal with that? And it's almost like reenacting it over and over again in a space, but through an art form. I also, you know, love to use a lot of malleable materials like rubbers, different types of rubbers, and often latex, because latex, you know, at most a 20-year shelf life. It often starts to kind of degrade right away. If you look closely, you'll see parts of it getting white from exposure to air. And it's very different from silicone rubber, which is, you know, they're trying to make that stay for a very long time so you can make your casts and your molds. So I was fascinated by latex and other rubbers that just can't stand the test of time, because they would, you know, I would often pour them over, or brush them over a form, and then have that form then in that rubber and hang it up as a painting to talk about those objects. But the objects I would often throw them away or give them back to somebody who'd given it to me for some reason, or leave them behind. And it was so that I would no longer have access to them. And the only thing left for the viewer was that latex record. But being aware that that record is also degrading slowly over time, and that it won't last, you know. I have some of the pieces in storage wrapped up neatly, but I know what's happening in that plastic. They're going, and I'm fascinated by that, because it's like reliving that sense of no access to what's important to you or what you put meaning onto, you know. And it reflects, I think, a lot of, just to quickly add this, you know, when I came to the US, whenever my mother would work, she's a physician, so she was working full time. My grandmother, my dad's mother, would take care of me a lot. So she was kind of another primary caretaker for me. And we spent a lot of time together as I was, you know, my initial years. And when I came over when I was 6, I remember the day we left Iran, and my mind just not taking it, just knowing that I would never see her again. I had this hunch. And so I had to kind of lie to myself and say, oh, we'll be back in a few years. We'll see her again, just so I wouldn't like, split. It was that traumatizing. And that lived with me for a while, that and access to a culture that's mine, which I'll never have. That became a kind of these rubbers, these plastics, the plastics that I use in more recent work that I shape over objects, these all become kind of the vehicle for that idea that, okay, we can get an impression, literally an impress or impression, but it's very precarious. The plastics I use harden over time, and they're very easy to crack. As they're, molecularly changing with the air. And so they're also, no matter how much you try to protect them in boxes and such, they get chipped very easily. And as an artist, it's devastating, but as a person who's really indebted to the concept, I love that the materials do that, because they're saying, and here we are. This is an example of the life that you're talking about, the displacement that you're talking about, the lack of safety and permanence. And I know Dawn had asked us about, the sense of ephemerality. And I think the only situation where I would say my work is not perfectly ephemeral, I mean, recently I've been doing 2D work where I'm back on the canvas and on paper. That for me was actually a very uncomfortable, frightening transition to start bringing that into my life. Because for me, the canvas, especially when it's made of materials that do last, or papers that are acid-free that do last longer, I'm basically being asked to root myself in a home and a place and to sit still with it. Normally I would be, these installations that are in different places, or, these kind of post-studio type practices where you don't have to be in the white walls and you could be out somewhere doing this work, was a relief because it was temporary. I didn't have to be rooted there. And as soon as it was over, it was like, I can move on now. Everything's going to be fine because I don't have to deal with that question of who am I? Do I have a place when I'm here? Because I know from the beginning, it's not my place, So once it got to, can you sit in your studio and do this work on 2D and be okay with that? It took me years to be able to do that. And these materials that might seem very comfortable for people were terrifying for me. And I would talk to people about it like, oh, just even putting oil stick on paper and being able to sit for 2-3 hours at a time to do that. The anxiety was severe, so severe that I started to call some of my drawings and series the anxiety drawings, because it was, again, being okay with where I was, being okay with myself there, and working in something that's a little bit more grounded and permanent, in quotes, permanent. So I think it was strange because some people were like, I don't understand that. Why would you be afraid of your own studio? And it's like, it's for the very reasons that I sadly am trying to get, like I am trying to get rooted. I am trying to have a stable life and a sense of stability. I want the work to convey that. And yet it's terrifying because it's very alien to me. I was always jealous of people who knew who their family members were. Their family members were always around them. They didn't live too far from each other. They had the luxury of complaining about them because it was like, oh, my grandmother, I have to see her this Christmas. And it's like, oh, what a luxury to be able to complain about that because I won't see mine ever again. And that was, she was a second mom. So, the very things I want, I'm terrified of, and so hopefully this work actually conveys that. It's somehow to the viewers, even if the viewer comes from a much more privileged, lucky, I would say. I think a lot of privilege is just luck that you're born into a certain situation, and stable, and if you haven't moved around and you've had that one zip code, you're a very lucky person, and that zip code can mean something. But also when I intentionally throw these objects away, Or, I had some artists when I was doing a residency at Banff recently gave me objects just out of their own will. I was very thankful for them. Some of them degraded under the heat of the plastic. They just didn't last for that reason. Some of them I very politely gave back, and I said, thank you so much. Your imprint and presence around me in my life just became a part of this piece, but I can't hold on to it because then I'm rooting the work, and that's against the concept of this piece, and a lot of them understood, what that meant, and that it was the gesture that I was collecting. And again, to use your word, it's the memory of that moment and that object that I'm collecting, not the actual thing. And when I did that with these materials, the pieces were often, again, precarious. They were in very thin plastics, and I'm continuing to work on them and present them in kind of a installational, large-scale painting kind of way, and working around those. But very sometimes challenging to work with because they get ruined so easily. I mean, it's amazing how careful you have to be with something. And I'm more of like a flaily artist. I like the energy and get dirty. And then these things are asking me to be a little bit more gentle with the history. The cheap part, I think, in it is kind of the documentation of all this work. I'm able to have a portfolio because either me or somebody I hired took out a camera and made these things exist a little longer than its existence. And for a while, they were tied down to an external hard drive, and that's where they existed. They were still in a precarious moment because those drives can have a problem. Now they're even a little more permanent in the sense that I'm using clouds, and I'm like, what does that mean if I back it up in a cloud? Now I'm making it a really permanent piece. What does that mean for the work? And that was a dilemma for me at first. When I first started to doing these things, I thought, part of the process should be I should erase everything. There should be nothing left, but then only the people that went to that exhibit would know that it existed, and do I want to be that hardcore with that concept? Or do I want to have the portfolio to then get a chance to bring this sense into other spaces and see where it goes? So I chose the latter, and I felt like that was a cheat. That was a cheat. But it's also, how does an artist hold on to their work and all that work that you do, So I think documentation and materiality have kind of been working either together or kind of struggling with each other as I do these concepts behind my work. So
that is fascinating. There's so much in there that I feel like that could be like a symposium just based on what you already said.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what really struck me is ideal without anchor. I think that phrase is absolutely brilliant, and is maybe the phrase that I have never been able to articulate, right? But this approach of being an artist almost as a means to articulate ideas without anchors, I think is fascinating. And as you were talking about, this kind of shift into two dimensions and the kind of permanence that brings, I realized, and I've never thought about this before, my process has been in some ways the reverse of that, in that my degree was in photography, weirdly enough. And I always knew that it wouldn't be that. I always knew that that was a means to an end for me, and it always felt that way. But when I mean, this is, 20 years ago now, but when I first finished school and I was just trying to figure out what does this mean and what do I do and who am I, all of those kinds of questions that I still ask, but I asked more frequently then, I guess. And so I was setting up these kind of moments of transience that I would then record. And at that point, I realized I had lost a couple of very close family members, and I was just dealing with the choice to be far away from my family and what that meant for a family who had to uproot, and the experience that brings for my parents, who I'm extremely close with, and then also just my role as a woman in an Italian family and what that means from a very traditional. So there were just like all kinds of things that were happening there, right? But I would photograph. I did a lot of work with ice and like placing things in ice, but then I would photograph it with like a 5.4 camera. So there was this idea of a mechanical permanence, right? So it's kind of, you know, the early onset of photography and what that means, and just the ritual of like literally putting your head under a black cloth and able to see this thing, and this really, you know, this antique piece of machinery that is needed, and then this entire chemical process that's needed to make that happen. So it was almost like a testament to how important capturing time was in the effort that it took to capture these objects, right? And then, you know, I went through a number of, like, just, I went through life in certain ways, you know, and for a while I took a break from making work because I was in debt. Like I needed to figure out who I was and what I was doing and how I was going to be able to pay my bills, right? So I was like, I need to take a break. I need to reevaluate. And then when I came back to it, I started drawing because I was so terrified of it. Because I just felt like I don't know how to start with nothing. I think that's the thing that photography let me into, is you had to, for me, I wasn't, you know, a documentary photographer. I didn't photograph people, but it started with an assemblage of objects that meant something to me in whatever way that was, right? But to me, drawing was the scariest thing in the world, because I was like, how do you look at a piece of paper and do something with that? I don't know. And so I feel like over the years, I developed these rules and these systems as a way to protect myself from that fear that was really paralyzing me. And at the time, I was making work looking at my own upbringing and what meant stability to my family, right? So just hearing you say that, I realized it made so much sense for that work to be on paper. And I was absolutely fanatical about everything had to be acid free, everything, like all the inks had to be pigment based. For a long time, I only worked on acid free vellum and black pigment ink. And the only variable was the line width, right? So I had such a restricted set of materials to work from. And a part of it was that I was physically retracing my own upbringing in terms of patterns and architecture and all of these other kinds of things. But it was also that these are impressions, these are memories, right? And so I think in some ways those works were about permanently imprinting my impression of that memory in a way that I understood it, right? And I remember the very first solo show I had with these drawings, one of my closest friends wrote the catalog essay for me. And he just said, the way that you're working now, it's like you're redrawing your own upbringing so that it serves you. And it was such a powerful way to think about it, because I was like, that's exactly what I'm doing, right? And so I did that. I had this very restricted way of working for many years, and then it started to expand into the wider structure of why my family looks the way it looks. Why are we on 3 different continents? What actually made us be separate? So I have a lot of family in Australia. So thinking about, like, was that by choice? Was that because of policy? What did that all look like? And since I started working with that, the installations have become much more ephemeral in terms of like, well, the materials are permanent, the installation is so temporary. And I know that you'll relate to this. I remember the piece that I mentioned about the stairway at Ellis Island. Taking that piece down was one of the most depressing moments of my career, because we spent days. I mean, I spent a year planning it. And then I think it was 6 days, 6 very long days with help to install it. And all it took to take that down was a pair of scissors, and it was gone. And the whole thing just crumpled, right? And I just remember thinking, this will never exist again in this way, right? So I feel like the installation work that I do is very much between the 2 phases that you're talking about, and that the materials always exist, but the manifestation of that will never be the same twice.
Yes. Yeah.
And that, I think, is really important, because it's like, it's understanding the baseline of this imprint of memory, but acknowledging that the memory will always change.
Yes.
And even the same memory will always change.
Mhm.
So even, you know, as this idea of time, memory, and place expanded into works that look at civic infrastructure and ecology, and specifically the LA River, there's a whole body of work that's based on redrawing a map as a line, and then echoing out from that line with each line only based on the last,
Mhm.
right? So there's a kind of dual meaning in that ecologically we can only work from where we are. So I think, you know, in ecological progression terms, there's a lot of, oh, we should revert to what we were doing X number of years ago, but now we've created a completely new culture and ecosystem that cannot be ignored, right? So in some ways, it's just acknowledging that everything is a part of a system and we can't discuss things in isolation. The other thing is, of course, in relation to memory, the fact that we're always remembering based on our own recollection. And, you know, there's data that I find so fascinating and is so true, in my experience, that, you know, the memories that are more true are the ones that we recall the least, because every time we recall it, that memory is serving us right now. So, you know, and it's like you see it in your own family. I do for sure. And I'm sure that people see it in me when I tell stories, like every time it's probably just a little bit bigger or a little bit more scary, or it was a little struck, right? So it's this idea that everything is based on the last imprint.
Mhm.
And I think in some ways that's why I'm so drawn to your work, is because even as I'm experiencing it in person, it's there's such fragility in it that I can't really know if I'm looking at the imprint that you made, or the imprint that the wind is leaving me, or the, you know what I mean? Or just, it feels like there's so many environmental factors that could influence the tiniest shifts in the kinds of work that you make, that in some ways it's like nature versus nurture, right? I'm like, so how much of the artist am I seeing, and how much of the world am I seeing?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so I feel like the work that you make creates that third space
Mhm.
based on the kind of fragility that you're talking about, which is why I
Mhm.
think it's in part so powerful.
Mhm. There are a couple pieces, as you were saying that. I have a piece called Imprints back from, I believe it was 2014, maybe a little earlier, and it was you know, imprints of people's bodies on the copper, because copper loves to absorb all that oil, and there were two versions, and they were shown in different spaces, and um, the the end part of the piece, it was about 96 inches, 94 to 96 inches long, was very crisp and clean and flat, you know, originally. As these two pieces have been moved around, and I've moved around so much, of course, which is very, you know, like reliving that trauma, moving around. Um, it was trucks, different people helping me. It was in plastic, then it was in a box. I mean, it was just, these pieces are completely different now. They've only retained a little bit of the crumpling in the beginning that I had done, but they can't hold themselves up in the same way, because the copper was so thin. It was paper thin that, in fact, some people thought it was made of paper, but it just couldn't handle it. And that was kind of the point. But there was such a sadness to it. When I look at it, I'm like, that other piece is gone, you know, and the body of this work, literally the body of it, is changing and becoming something else. And I think it reminds me so much of our bodies and how we are. And the other day I was thinking, you know, I have this idea of when I was 25, and like, oh, I can always go back to that somehow, you know. And there was a moment where I'm like, no, I can't. That was over with, you know. In fact, the day I turned 25, 25 was over with, you know, because then it was the next day and the next day. And this concept is with me, an idea, and to use your phrase, a memory of this thing, this person, and me thinking I can go back to that. And it's like, there's just no way. So many shifts and imprints are happening with me, and with other people around me, and with the settings we're in, that we think or we say are permanent, but they're just not. And uh, you know, these pieces are trying to represent that, you know, and some of them take some beatings, you know. These U-Haul trucks that I've been using really shifted things around as I took turns, and that imprinted the piece, and I'm like, oh, that's going to be a that's going to be a mark, you know. And you know, even the programs I came from, when I talk to people, art programs, when I talk to people that graduated after me, their concept of it and what they were talking about is completely different from mine. So even though we sat in the same studios and the same zip code in different years, created work in there, the comments, the structure, everything was different and had shifted, so that, you know, someone can say, oh, I went to Otis or wherever else, but we went to different Otises, you know. So, and that reflects into our work too. And it's in the work as we talk about it. So I think these kinds of shifts are an ephemerality and attempts of nailing down a sense of something or several somethings to say, oh, these 10 things were a part of my life. Even those, it's frustrating because you just can't, you know, hold on to it. So, you know, near the end of my life, I'm like, what will these pieces be? Will they even exist? I have one piece that I loved, and very sadly the material couldn't take it. And I kind of knew that when I chose the material, but it's from my Portrait of Amir series, where I looked at a friend of mine, Amir, and I took his essence, the sense I was getting off of him, and the things he would say, how he would laugh, all of it, and I would put it into these installations. And one of them was based on a photograph of him, and it was basically oil clay that I had put inside a, it's actually a rubber, I'm forgetting what the hardware used for it is, but it's a rubber piece that's only an inch wide, and that was his portrait within that. The oil clay just couldn't hold up, you know. It started to bleed the oil out over time in different storage areas, and even though it was packed away neatly, it couldn't handle it, and the colors bled into each other, so that the last time I went to check on it, I was like, oh, it's basically mud. So he was gone, and I had to make the tough decision of discarding him. And recently someone was like, oh, I like that piece, could we have it in a show? And I said, I'm so sorry, that piece didn't make it. You know, I would have had to bring a pile of mud to them, you know. And that was very hard to realize, but, you know, I didn't want to keep that pile of oil and mud with me, you know. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I think it's also interesting in terms of um, this is a little bit off topic maybe, but also kind of related in terms of what art is, right? Like art with a capital A, where if you think about how, you know, museums and institutions operate, and the general feeling of what art should be, it's like there's this very traditional approach that says it should be permanent, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
this idea of archival stability and you know, UV protection and like what kind of solvents are you using, all of this other stuff. And I think what's so fascinating is that your work just takes that on from the outset, saying
Mhm.
like a lot of this just isn't going to make it, you
Mhm.
know. And it's so interesting to me how that functions within this space where it feels like in a lot of ways what we're all searching for all the time is permanence.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think in some ways this idea of museums collecting objects, whether
Mhm.
they be cultural, whether they be looted, whether they be not looted, you know, I mean, again, that's like a whole other conversation. But this idea of collecting objects, I think, is really a search for permanence in
Mhm.
many ways.
Mhm.
Um, and I think one of the things that makes me make the work that I make is because I don't think that exists. I
Mhm.
really don't. And, you know, my earlier work was really thinking about the sort of generational difference
Mhm.
between myself and my parents, where, you know, after their personal and familial journeys, permanence was absolute key for them, right?
Mhm.
And then I think it was really confusing when I chose to uproot myself. And again, that's a huge position of privilege, and I 100% acknowledge that. But it was also when my family moved to the South, I instantly thought, I don't belong here.
Mhm.
So then there was this idea of like, I'm going to go back to New York because that's where I belong. But then I went back to New York, and because I was 9 when I left, people kept saying, oh, but you're not really from here. And I was like,
Mhm.
no, because I spent the last 9 years waiting to come back here, right? So
Mhm.
also this idea of like where you're from and how you identify and how you tell your story
Mm-hmm.
became really important. Also from being in another country and realizing that if I say that I am from New York, I'm much more interesting to
Yeah.
people than if I say that I'm from Atlanta, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so understanding that this when we move around a lot,
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reason, we now have a story to edit,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And a way to kind of craft that story. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember speaking with somebody, this was years ago, and we started talking about this, and she said, yeah, she was like, I moved around a lot, and where I'm from depends on who I'm talking to.
Wow.
and,
That's amazing.
and what I need from that conversation, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
she was like, if I'm in a small town doing research, I say I'm from Kansas because that's where I was born. But
Mm-hmm.
if I'm at a museum function, I say that I'm from New York because that's where I spent most of my life, right? So
Mm-hmm.
also this idea that even something that is generally considered permanent
Mm-hmm.
is also malleable, right?
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
that's something I'm very interested in this sort of search for permanence, but also a search for identity within permanence.
Mm-hmm.
Is for me, okay, there's a certain set of truths. There's the truth of the hospital that I was born in. There's
Mm-hmm.
the truth of the fact that my family has lived in 3 of the 5 boroughs, right? There are these certain sort of geographic truths. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's why maps and cartography became such an important part of what I do, because it's almost like, I think about it like, if you watch kind of cheesy crime shows, or not cheesy crime shows, right? And they're trying to map out cases,
Mm-hmm.
and they use red string that's connecting. It's like, I feel like I did that very early on to try and understand where's the permanence? Because
Yes.
I don't feel any of that.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the permanence? Because now, if I think about how I associate with culture, then my parents, who are my closest family, no longer live in the culture that I felt was mine, and that even they felt was theirs to a certain degree. Because they're still like, you can't not know that they're from New York. Like, you cannot, right?
Yeah.
Now
Mm-hmm.
35 years in, people are like, oh, you must be from New York. And they're like, yeah, of course. So
Yeah.
they never identify as people, like they identify where they live as home, but
Mm-hmm.
they are 100% not Southerners. You know what I mean? So really thinking about how we use this narrative as a way to craft how we present ourselves. And in
Mm-hmm.
some ways, in the case of you and I, how we use our creative practice as a way to signify permanence or impermanence, or the space between the two, because that's actually where we're always living.
Yes, yeah. And I feel like I love that analogy, or that visuals of kind of the crime shows, the forensic files of, which I love, of the red yarn. It's almost like what I'm hearing you say is like, you set up that map between these parts and these pieces with this red yarn, and then you go home and you come back the next day and it's shifted, because it has to, it's just the process of meaning making and how things are tied to each other, and it could never be the exact grid that you had in the first place,
Right.
which I think is amazing because of the many possibilities it presents, and devastating because it's like, oh, where do I hold on to? What do I hold on to? And how
Right.
can I describe myself? I think, what you said about your friend, and just presenting a different story each time about the same place and the same incident. There's places I highly edit, like I'll be in, and this is just kind of a quick digression, but related, but I'll be in Colorado, and I used to live there for a couple of years, and it was a completely different culture from the East Coast where I'm from. And in California, they're all like their own countries. And I still am afraid to say that I'm Muslim there, and it's not something I practice, so it's not overt, and I'm not tied to it directly. And yet I'm afraid to mention that that's part of my background, because I don't know what kind of thinking I'm around. And I ran into a lot of conservative mindsets, especially the further south I went, but it was everywhere. And I kind of was like, let me not mention that. Let me not talk about which country I'm from, because I don't know what the reaction's going to be. So my story was edited for where I was and who I was speaking to. So that really, really spoke to me when you mentioned that. For your piece for the show itself, is there anything else that you think you'd like to talk about for that piece in particular for our conversation? Because I think Dawn did a really great job of finding all of us and thinking about our work and choosing pieces. And if there's anything else that you should add about it.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for asking that. I think the piece that I'm showing for this project in particular is a video work that I'm really excited to show because it was only shown once, and it feels increasingly important to me. And so the piece is a video from the Narrows, and the Narrows is the stretch of land that when immigrant ships were coming from Europe, when they passed through the Narrows, they would see the Statue of Liberty, right? So for many immigrants, for many people who had just made that journey, it was almost like, you're so close, right? You're so close. And there's this iconic statue that's, you know, kind of welcoming you in, and you know that you're in the right place, and you know, and you've made it, like you've made it at this part of your journey. But then in those waters, you're still technically not in America. So even though you're so close, until your process of you know, checks and balances, so to speak, at Ellis Island is complete, you are not yet in America. So it's like you're physically here, but you're still in liminal waters, quite literally, right? So I was thinking a lot about that space, and a lot about the space of the in-between, and how just the emotion attached to that. And so the piece is actually, it's footage that I shot in 2017, and it's being on the boat going from Battery Park to the Statue of Liberty. And so it's just like a very tight shot, a very unedited shot of this water and this journey. And then the audio is it's excerpts from 3 oral history interviews with women that had come from Italy and gone through Ellis Island. And what felt really important about it was there's one woman's story who is so emotional. It took me years to be able to not cry when I listened to it. And she's so passionate and articulate. But the thing that really struck me about her story is so much of it is as told by her sisters. So it's what we're talking about memory, because she was 4 when they came. And so it's this incredibly emotional story about like being on the boat, how they were treated on the boat, how, you know, they were a group of kids, and so the captain looked out for them. And there are these moments where the interviewer would say, oh, so, you know, how did you feel at that moment? And she would say, oh, well, you know, it was terrifying as my sisters tell it. So what's interesting is this whole experience that she has completely built her identity on, understandably, is as told by her family. Yes. So it really speaks to this idea of the third space, right? It speaks to this idea of what we keep, how we edit, how we narrate, and also what is this third space of truth versus memory. So that is really important. And then, you know, and also as a part of her story, she actually talks about the color of water as a signifier, which I thought was just such a beautiful moment of like how there are so many signifiers that identify what home is, right? And that can be like, for me, it's like when I come out of a certain tunnel in LA, I feel comfortable because I feel like, okay, now I'm in my neighborhood, right? Or when I was in London forever and I lived in the same flat for years, there was one corner that I would turn and I could feel myself let my guard down a little bit because I was now on autopilot, because I knew those streets like the back of my hand. So I think that signifier of the color of water was really important as well, in terms of what are these signifiers that make us feel safe, right? So yeah, and then, yeah, and so I also think it's really powerful for me when I was at the Ellis Island Archives and really started working with oral histories as a research methodology, of hearing these, because my focus was on women at the time, like women who came in the early 20th century, basically women like my great-grandmother who brought my grandfather, right? So the power of listening to somebody's voice, I think especially through headphones, is that there's no date stamp on it, right? these women could be here right now. This could have been in 1940. This could have been in 1980. So I think having this really intimate conversation almost with these very difficult stories of why people came, how they were separated from families, how they're reunited with families, what it means to see this icon that makes you feel like you have the opportunity to be safe when you came from somewhere that was not safe, feels really important right now. And I would actually say, you know, the residency was in 2012, and I had been listening to these stories ever since, and I would revisit them periodically. And for ages, I just thought, like, I don't know what to do with this. I really didn't know what to do with the content, first of all, because it's other people's stories. And so it's such an honor and such a risk to work with this material, especially when most of these people are gone. I have no way of contacting them, you know. So thinking like that is a huge responsibility. So I can only do that when I feel like I genuinely understand what that responsibility is and how to articulate that in a way that honors them in the highest regard. But the other thing is, when the 2016 election happened, I was like, I just have to tell these stories. I mean, or like I had not I have to tell these stories. I have to create a vehicle for these stories to be told, because they're not my stories to tell, right? So understanding, like, all of a sudden it made sense why I would not be interpreting, but just be creating a platform for these voices to have their own space. Because again, it's not my experience, it's not my story to tell. So I think this piece was really, it was critical for me in a lot of ways. Even, you know, since then I've gone on to work on projects where we've actually founded oral history archives, so that we can ensure that people have the opportunity to tell their story in their own words. So it really shifted not only what I think my responsibility as an artist and a storyteller, but also what my responsibility is as a person who has space and has the opportunity to work with institutions, to actually use the privilege of those institutions to build new archives and to build new opportunities for people to tell their stories, so that we don't fall into this pattern of Western history where, you know, in 30 years, a white guy comes in and writes a history that he only knows via a white history, right? So really thinking about, like, how as artists to use our privilege in order to not just create this platform, but also to create new systems and new vehicles for people to tell their own stories.
What I found interesting about your video was that, you know, aside from, yes, you're there in the sense of you chose the water to show, and then also the three different women that you chose to have their audio laid out and in what order, I still felt there was a level of objectivity to it, which I liked, because I felt like the piece wasn't telling me how to feel about each woman's story and memory. I wasn't told to feel sad about anyone or be happy about it. There was nothing telling me. And so I felt the freedom to be able to feel the work and see the work as it triggered things in me, you know, and my filters and my experience. What I liked about the piece very much is that by the time we got to the third person who was telling her story, it was such a different experience for each person. You know, you had the heavy sadness in the beginning, then you had someone singing, you know, and it was such it lifted me, you know, and I was going through so many emotions with these people. And it made me think about how, when presented with similar or even the same situation, how we all do edit our stories and what we hold on to and decide to talk about, and in what tone and emotion. And sometimes maybe it's wired in us, so there's no control over it. And sometimes it's a, you know, intellectual choice. But I almost, it kind of pictured, as the women were talking, almost like this octopus that was like holding on to different things with its tentacles. And these could either change but each woman was holding on to something else from a similar experience. And for one person, it was devastating, even though it was channeled through sisters' stories, you know. whereas someone else was able to be light enough about it to sing, or or to just kind of have a little less emotional voice as they were talking about the experience. I think that that's what's so interesting about work like this, because then it's saying that there's so many stories, each of them are valid, but just know that, this side of sadness is also happiness. This side of the devastation is also something really beautiful about what happened. And that's, in a sense, it's the human experience, right? So that it's, again, even that concept of permanence and impermanence, that's such a human existential situation. And as artists, I think we also face that, because it's like, there's the question of how long is my work going to last? Am I going to be, there's the aspirations of some of my friends, even me, sometimes I'm like, wouldn't it be great to be the next Van Gogh, like where the work lasts. And I recently went to a Van Gogh exhibit out in Germany a few months ago, and it was fascinating to read about who made him that person. And it wasn't him, it was the other people. And after his death is when it caught on. And so other people were telling the stories of this man, and like how he painted. And it's like, wow, even when the work, if it lasts somehow, it's going to be filtered so much. It's a different story. And hopefully some remnants of what the artist intended will be there, but maybe none of it. And I think sometimes when people compare, they'll say, oh, do you know Ava Hess? When they first saw me making the rubber pieces. And when I first started, I actually didn't know about her rubber pieces. I knew about some of her other works, and I said, oh, I have to check that out. And I was fascinated by reading about these conservators trying so hard to like hold on to this piece. And, can we still hang it? Is it going to fall apart? How do you have this tiny piece still like linger on, And it was just like, oh my God, do you just let it go and let it sit in the museum or the gallery and just let it degrade, let it do its thing until there's not much left? Or do you do what they've been trained to do, which is like, how can we conserve this as long as, and there's always that dilemma of, how, do you let it go? Do you just let it go, or do you hold on to it? And it reminds me of these dreams I had, which have worked their way into my plastic paintings where I do the imprints, where I would have these nightmares when I was growing up in Massachusetts as a kid, because I didn't realize that I had been so traumatized by the move over from Iran to the US. And I would have these nightmares of being in my parents' car, and we're packing and we're throwing suitcases into the car, and we have to make sure everybody's in the car, and we have to make sure all our stuff is there. And I would even hold on to napkins, that had been used for crying and blowing your nose and things like that, things that you just throw away. And I was trying to hold on to those desperately. And I would wake up stressed out that one of them fell out of the car onto the highway. And I was like, no, we have to go back and get that used napkin that holds the histories of these tears and all of these changes in our bodily fluids. And so a lot of these types of seemingly mundane objects then made their way into these plastic paintings that I do. A lot of times, some of the pieces, there'll be like a little wrapping from where I made the work. I'll notice something on the ground that I've either discarded, or someone that's with me as an assistant has dropped, and I'll pick it up. And now it's become a part of the work, because this mundane thing was part of this moment. And I think that's a part of my work, and I don't know if this resonates with you, but how to highlight the mundane, how to make it seem so precious, almost like precious next to that vase that's so gilded and precious already, because of its materials and the process, and it's in the museum, and all these frames around it that tell you that it's significant and precious. How do you do that with a piece of wrapper that nobody cares about? It's going to be discarded anyway after I get the imprint. And, to me, it's because, as I've said in some artist statements, all of these moments for a lot of us, even our making in the studio, they're the most of our life. The mundane moments are actually the majority of it. You know, some of the celebrated noticeable moments of, oh, she got married or this happened or that, that's a very framed, like the vase moment, but that's not the most of it. And I think we kind of put aside these mundane things and think this is nothing. And it's like, no, that wrapper had to do with everything you just did this moment. And if it didn't exist, you wouldn't have the tool that you just used, you know? And so holding on to it and saying, okay, that's important. But then also you got to let go, you know, you can't collect the stuff around you. You know, I watch Hoarders, that show, and I'm always like, oh, they're collecting everything they're afraid to let go. And it reminds me of my nightmare of that napkin, of like letting that go. And it's like the last thing you would hold on to is what you've like wiped your tears with or blown your nose with in sadness or, and you know, it's funny, I didn't realize how much of this imprinted on myself that now at 43, I'm making work that's talking about something like that. And I think listening to your work, these women, it was really touching to listen to them talk about this passage too, and seeing this water and this water as just a vehicle of changing someone from point A to point B, but water itself is so ever changing. It just never sits still, you know? So just an amazing thing to be seeing, and its color to be noting, because that's also never going to be grounded, you know? But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That makes me so happy. Just I feel like, you know, especially working with ideas that are so close to my heart and so close to my experience, I can't be outside of them. But I felt like those three stories in particular were really powerful, also just because of politically what's happening now. And I don't view time as linear. I think time is this sort of collapsible, expansive, elastic sort of, I like the term octopus because I think it is kind of an octopus, right? Like, and it feels like the tentacles are in front of you and behind you, and again, everything that's happened before is creating everything that happens now, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's both personal and political. And so when I revisited this information, you know, in light of the politics of even 4 years ago, which of course we're miles away from yet again. But even in that moment, especially hearing one of the women speaking about being reunited with her father and you know, being separated from families, and just understanding this is not, that is not history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, as you say, like the day you turned 25, you weren't 25 anymore. You were now 25 in a day, right? So understanding that I think there's an increasing urgency to understanding that our conversation right now is history, right?
Yeah.
And that even seeing now how, you know, I think a great example is with monuments being toppled and people saying you shouldn't erase our history. My response to that is, this is history. This uprising is history. This kind of, this, you know, addressing a balance of power is history. This is history in the making, this moment internationally. And so I think it's also thinking about this idea of history and reality and past and present, because they are not separate, right? So that feels really important to me, and that's kind of in, I think that's really imprinted in the work from the Narrows. And now, you know, that I've had a little bit of time since making it, and, you know, looking more at like broader structures and all these other things, and thinking, okay, like, how do I come back to that? And actually, since then, I've done a lot of work with oral histories, and I'm about to do more work with oral histories. So in some ways, I went from working with the past history, and now I feel like I'm working with the history that we are living and creating, and that I'm lucky enough to be a part of, you know. But with that, I'd love for you to talk about your work for the show, because that's like a different kind of history, right?
Yeah, very much. And it has like a personal bent. And I was talking to Dawn, I'm like, maybe I'll talk about it, maybe I won't, because I notice sometimes with art, it's very tricky to talk about super personal, kind of emotional things, almost the psychological things we go through. Because when I've talked about them before, sometimes the audience is like, "Oh, do you need a hug?" You know, kind of like, that's not why I'm talking about it,
Yes,
you
I know
know?
exactly what you mean. Yeah,
Yeah, or they kind of feel sorry for me and they mean well. And it's like, that's
yeah,
not why I told this story. I'm just recounting something. If I have emotions around it, that's because I was the subject. But really, I'm recounting it as if you read any story,
right.
and you don't need to give me a hug. In fact, please don't, because it feels condescending.
Yeah,
But this,
it's amazing.
yeah, right.
Yeah. Thanks
This,
for offering. Please don't.
yeah. I know you mean well, but it hurts when you hug me. But the so the basic is she's grabbed a few photographs that I did, and they're actually not big. They're kind of very slim, like 11 inches, and I think it was 24, something like that. Um, and there was a handful of them, and they're layers of images of hotel rooms that I stayed in as I was going across the country, more than once. And it's, from different cameras I've had. One of them was from, the old school digital cameras where you kind of held it, and then I somehow managed to transfer them over to files and keep them. And then they were layered with what I had through all the different phones I had: an iPhone, a Samsung, an Android. I had all three. And I'm keeping the memory through all these phones, files and folders. And I put them all over each other and in different formats and they represent the different beds that I was in these hotel rooms. Sometimes it's the comforter pattern that you see. Sometimes it's what I was watching on the television. There's somebody's hand from a televangelist that I normally wouldn't watch, but he kept talking about hope over and over again. And that's what I was listening to as I was going through a very difficult, unstable time in my life. Just going across country, and all I had was the car and hotel rooms, because I was too afraid to sleep in my car as a woman alone. I didn't want any bad things to happen, so I would have to shell out the money for a hotel room. And these hotel rooms became, ironically, safe spaces for me, because they're kind of, they're almost like that third space. They're not tied to where I'm coming from or where I'm supposedly going to. They're ephemeral. They're always going to change. I can only check in for a night or two at best. And the people I meet there, I remember maybe some of the people at the front desk that some were kind, some were not. And it's just their faces shift when I think about them. It's maybe somebody else's face there when I think about those moments. And I tried to capture these in these photographs, and I manipulated their colors and their shapes in some ways, because I was trying to represent memory and instance and place, and how remembering it is not like the perfect photo that I took of like, oh yeah, that's a desk and that's the curtains, and so I'm like, okay, you see the curtains, but you're also seeing another hotel room on top of that, because I don't remember what was where. And I went to so many, this all started when I was 29 and it's continued until 43. I don't remember, there was one in, I think it was New York, and I really loved the place. It felt safe. The way I picture it in my mind is different from the photograph. And the photograph, I'm not so sure it was in New York, like it's just because I didn't have, they were all digital. I didn't write file names under them. They all just collected. I didn't print anything out and write on the back, like, Utica, or wherever, Sometimes when I think about where someplace was, I have to look up the town, because I would stay in really, some of them were so rural, or like the places I had never heard of in the US. And it's because I was tired of driving and I had to find a hotel somewhere. And so I would end up in that town. I have to look it up to see if it existed, if the name I'm remembering is actually a name of a place, so that's how much things keep shifting. These are the only memories or instances or remnant I use the words remnant or trace or record a lot in when I'm talking about my work, because those three are ways of describing what's left, which is these photographs that now Dawn's going to be uploading digitally. And they're emotional for me because they are a no space and yet a space. You know, they did exist, and some of them probably still do. And they were no space because I didn't have a place to go to. So then I went into this no place. And I feel like the third space is a no place also. It's also a way of checking out of what you're supposed to be tied to and can't deal with, or have been kicked out of, or whatever the situation is. And you decide to go to that space. And a lot of times people go to hotel rooms, you know, for these things, and sometimes devastating things. I met a girl when I lived in Boulder, Colorado, and I finally found a place to rent. And she says, "Oh, I work at the different hotels in the town." And I said, "Oh, do you like working there?" And she said, "You know, one of the hardest things was walking in on a suicide that had happened in the room, because they had to clean the room, and some of these staff will see this." And she said to me, "You know, people choose these hotel rooms because it's not tied to their family or where they live. And sometimes they need a space that's not like this no place to do this kind of deed and not have it devastate anyone. They don't want someone walking in from family on them. So unfortunately, the cleaning staff has to deal with that, you know, strangers." And so I think there's that mystique of these hotels, these transient spaces. I think a lot of the colors and the compositions that happen in the work come from my education in Western art history has really affected me. So it's there, especially with minimalism. There's definitely every once in a while, something from my native culture will leak in. But for these pieces, I think my Western landscape, being in the US and the different states, and the art historical references that people see in them, that's from this education, this country, at least consciously, that I'm aware of. So, and they're little pieces, but I think they're loaded little guys, you know, that they're saying a lot. I know that, you know, if I talk about the televangelist, people don't see that when they look at the work, and I don't really need them to know that or see that. So they can either take what I just said as being significant or relevant to the piece, or they can take whatever they see when they look at the piece as being, because what I want the work to be is for the viewer to tie themselves to it somehow, kind of like, you know, the woman whose voices, the audios that you worked with, they're tying to something somehow, you know, and that tentacle holds on to this and says, "That's what it means. That's what it means to me." And so I want this work to allow them to do that. But I think it's also important to have these works, and I'm glad Dawn is taking them seriously, because they are personal, and they are, you know, when you have a car, you hope the car lasts, and that became my home. But the fact that that car is on wheels, and that I always kept my toothbrush and some soap in the, you know, glove compartment, it was transient, and yet it was privileged because I still had a working car. So was the privilege of being able to afford hotel rooms, and decent ones where I felt safe. So that means I had to pay more to be there. So this was all, when you talked about privilege, I really appreciated that word, because this was all privilege, even though it was so unstable. I think these spaces are important to talk about, because what passes through these structures is not nothing. It's actually, you know, when you talked about the stairs, what passed on those stairs was very significant. And maybe at the time when someone was using them, they weren't thinking that this was going to be a momentous thing, that they were stepping down here or up here. And it's going back to that thing of the mundane is actually significant. It really means something. It's a part of our lives. It forms that day. It forms our memory so that, you know, I'll be doing something and I'll flash to a room somewhere and I'm like, oh God, that room, that bed, you know, what city was that in? Which hotel was it? You know, and as a person who's been displaced and dislocated a lot, and intentionally does that now out of habit, out of knowing that pattern, instead of knowing what it's like to relax, stay in one place, stay in your studio, it's okay, you know. It becomes things that I edit into my story that I want to be there, for people to reflect on. And it's my only way of talking about myself. And sometimes I have this jealousy of a perceived sense of other people, because I think there are people that, oh, you know, they got married by this age, they had the kids by this age, they live in a nice neighborhood that could, you know, afford this and that, and everything fell together. How did it all fall together like this? Like, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm just sitting there like, oh, my life is like the exact opposite, you know? And someone once told me, you're always trying to, like, you know, it's like you're a square peg and you're trying to slam yourself into this round hole and it's just not going to happen, you know? And I was sad. I was like, well, how did they do it? How did they become round and they had a round hole, you know, like, and it just feels for me, even though I think technically it's not, that they're linear. And I'm like, how did you do linear? I want linear because it's stable, because it sounds amazing, that A results in B and then B to C, instead of things like A1 to A, you know, B6. And it's like, whoa, just, you know, and so this, I'm hoping the work gives at least a feeling of that, even if, you know, a statement isn't next to it or no one bothers to read anything about the work. It'd be good if a sense of that comes through. And I remember feeling successful when it was Cooper Johnson who saw one of my plastic paintings, a large piece, and he looked at it and he used the word frenetic for it. And I was really happy because he sensed something. My word was anxiety. The work is tied to all the things we've been talking about. And he was able to somehow get the essence of frenetic off of it. And there was a few other words he used, but like I just was, you know, people have said ecstatic, so many other words. That's just kind of like this inability to kind of, you know, anchor. And I think as long as the viewer can somehow get something of that and be able to talk about it when asked, then I've been successful in imparting my story, my history. And again, as each person has their own interpretation, it's shifting thanks to that. So again, it's never going to be solid, but at least somebody heard it, you know. Mm-hmm.
Well, what really strikes me about these works is that they, well, of course they are very personal to you because they're kind of your physical impressions of the world as you're moving through this transitory process, right? Mm-hmm. So as you say, it's like you're in these transitional spaces, but that give you a sense of safety, right? Mm-hmm. But what really strikes me about them is the layering. And I love the way you talk about remembering, but not remembering, about, like, you know, having to look up if that was the name, was it in this city? And even before, when you were talking about the mundane of the wrapper that goes into one of the paintings, you know, yes, there are these moments in life that tend to be, you know, birth, death, marriage, like these kind of things that are cultural markers for things that we're supposed to do, right? And again, I use that in inverted commas. But actually memory is the in-between of all of that, right? And I think the moments that, for me anyway, make me myself are the wrappers and the smell of a certain food And the feeling of being on a certain street at a certain time, or the way that light falls on a building at a certain time of day that makes you know you are where you are. And so I think one of the things that I'm drawn to with all of your work, but especially in these pieces, is this layering of environment and objects and pattern that, to me, it's that layering that actually creates this sort of tapestry of what a memory is, right? And as you were talking about the process of photographing these with various digital cameras and not documenting where they were, it also makes me think about our very human need to capture these memories. And I think, I think that's a lot of what my work has been, is like this obsessive need to kind of ridiculously document a moment, or to document something that only lives in my head, and I know it only lives in my head. So I'm going to write this thing, several thousand times into the form of this contour, just to prove that that's real, right? So in some ways it feels like I love these pieces so much, because they're an articulation of an experience that makes it real, but it's also the layering of that makes it your memory, which allows, in my opinion, allows a viewer in, because while we may not have exactly the same experience, what you're talking about is very human, right? And I think whether it's your experience of having the stability of your car be the permanence, but then these moments of safety, or someone else's experience of, living in one place, but feeling fragmented and moving through different spaces, it feels like these pieces are emblematic of the experience of transition and memory, and how we carry that with us. And so I think they're really, really important. And really, they're just really powerful, because I feel like there are so many access points for so many different experiences of just life. And I love that, based on the images that Dawn sent me, in each of these, it feels like there's a sort of impression of architecture, but then there's also an impression of there's an impression of like a hard architecture, like a window, but then, as you mentioned, like some of the patterns are from comforters or things like that. So there's the architecture, but then there's also the interior architecture of the things that physically support our bodies that we're in space. And then there's also these elements of textures that are the wrappers or the tissues, or, the things that we find comfort in. And I think especially when we're in transition, it's having those small things like a toothbrush, like a tissue, right? Just like having what you need becomes comfort, right? So these resonate with me so much, because I think, as a person who very much identifies with the third space, you very much feel like the third space, but then the structure of the work makes it feel safe, which I think is fascinating. So to go back to, your kind of an original idea that I love so much, of like idea without anchor, right? It feels like in some ways there's an anchor here, which is so fascinating. And so just like also thinking about that in relation to how you speak about making two-dimensional works and all of that, it feels like a really perfect evolution and sort of sister to the very ephemeral works, because that the energy is very much there and the shifting is very much there. And even though there's an anchor, these still feel impermanent, which I really love.
Yeah. And I think that's it's also my fascination with those objects of impermanence, or concepts of impermanence, or moments of that I'm holding on to, as you were saying that, I was reminded of, someone asking me in the past, like, why did you use copper to make your imprints pieces? And I remember saying, oh, because that's what's used in monuments, it degrades over time. I mean, copper is fascinating. It changes itself over time with, becoming green and beautiful, and what happens with its conversation with the air over time. And so I wanted to use that because that is a monumental material. And the pieces that I have in storage, they're slowly getting greener where everyone has touched. it's a slow process because they're in boxes rather than being blatantly out in the air, but that becomes part of the story. So copper can hold stories. Um, and when you had mentioned, the monuments that people are bringing down, and, a lot of other cultures already have in their histories brought down monuments, and um, that being a part of the story too, that you were saying, you know, it's, I think some people think you're eradicating that figure, and it's like, no, you're commenting on what that figure is and represents. So the figure is down, but it being brought down is part of its story, and who it supposedly represents, and how people remember that person, and what they did. And I think a lot of the molds I've been making, though I haven't presented them as much, because I'm still working on them. Some of them are made from silicone rubber, which is of course going to last a long time. And some of them are made from much more precarious materials that are changing over time. And I'm photographing, and hopefully will be like, here's what happened with these materials, and maybe one day I could do some kind of installation or something with them, but they would be degraded versions of what I initially brought out of the mold in my studio. But it's about that. It's about how, and I'm going to use, I think it was the New Museum that had the Unmonumental show a few years ago, how unmonumental a monument is, because we are not permanent, and we're trying to be so desperately trying to have, the linear memory, all these things we've been talking about, grounding, anchors, a sense of self and identity. I mean, all of these things that we're naturally not created as, and I think that's what's fascinating. When I have the catalog to the Unmonumental show. I'm trying to remember the year, 2012, maybe it was before then. It was fascinating to see all this work that was talking in that way, where it's about like this, it's inverting the sense of what you make monumental. It's also inverting the sense of what you put in a museum, so I think it was fascinating that it was in a new museum, and turning it on its head and saying that, what exactly are we thinking about what these artifacts are? So I think, I hope, these photos relate to that, of course, but they're always in different media. In this show, it's photography, but I hope to have some remnants to show of these unmonumental pieces and these materials that are ephemeral that I'm working on currently. But these photos are kind of that, because that digital camera that I originally used is gone, and the files that came from it, a lot of them disappeared between all the different discs and the clouds and everything. Some of them disappeared, and I can't find them. They're gone. So their record of them from all these different devices have disappeared. And what I have is what I kept and could layer into these photographs. And I'm trying to treat these photographs, the physical printouts I did, as kind of precious, because I know that one day I might not be able to place where the file for this is. And I either will have to recreate it, which will never be the same, or I'm going to have to let it go. And hopefully this piece of paper will last, So to say these hotel rooms happened, this person was in these hotel rooms, this photo happened. I mean, so many things will be lost from it. So I'm really glad that she's highlighting it, Dawn, because there's a moment of kind of a nod to the experience, kind of like, yep, thank you, and let's talk about this, and let's include it in the show. So it's been an honor to be included in the show and have her, see the work, because I think some of the moments I'm talking about are moments that are unseen, and they're experienced, and somebody needs to say, hey, look, this happened, do you want to take a moment and take a look at it? When I was watching your video, I was thinking about that as I was listening to the women. I was like, somebody just brought me stories of people I'm not going to meet. I didn't even know this happened. at all. And until you had made your peace, I wouldn't have known. And so now I know. And that's affected my story because I resonated so much with what I've gone through. And now I think about those women's voices that you presented in your work. So I think it's really great that Dawn is highlighting this for us. So
I agree. And I also love that it's being shown online, right?
Mhm.
Because I think so much of what we're talking about are these transitional spaces and is impermanence within a culture that seeks constant permanence. And so when she approached me about being in the show, I immediately felt like that was the right piece, because it's also about how to experience that work, right? And that is work that, like, I feel like it's best when you have headphones on. It's best when you're staring intently. And so I think to bring that into an intimate space, in the same way that I think your work is really intimate, these images are really intimate and are very much about transition, but within this space that, you know, that you physically are occupying. It's, you know, maybe by yourself a lot of the time, right? So there's an intimacy between you and these spaces.
Mhm.
And I think there's an intimacy between, I hope, you know, the people listening in these stories. And also this idea of, like, with having the video be an uncut, really tight shot, for me, it's almost like, and actually it's funny, I get the feeling when I look at this work as well, it's almost like, you know, when you first wake up and your vision is a bit hazy. And so like you can fixate on something, but there's something that's kind of not real about this thing that you're fixating on, even though you're seeing it.
Yeah.
And in some ways I view the online space as having the ability to translate that in a way that's more difficult than the physical world. And so it felt, I think she's done a really great job of choosing works that also serve a purpose in this context as well, which is another reason why I feel really excited to be a part of this, because it's, again, in the same way that I think both of us work with materials very intentionally, I also work with space very intentionally, as do you, right?
Yeah.
So I think in this moment where everything is upside down and we don't know what sharing space looks like, I think acknowledging the way that we're meeting for the first time today and the way that we're all kind of experiencing art in a different way right now is also really important, because space is also a material, right? So really thinking about it in those terms and selecting works that also reflect space as a part of the memory, as a part of the narrative, as a part of the story feels really exciting to me.
Yeah. And I think our positions behind that work are important. And I wonder what you think of this in terms of your own work, but in these photos, I'm always in the hotel bed taking a photograph. I'm always in that position of being in the bed. It's not from a chair or anything, or from the door of the bathroom looking in. And I wonder if your positioning behind the camera or different media you use factors into it, where you place yourself physically.
That's a great question. I think it does. I mean, it certainly does in the context of the video, in that it was shot from the perspective of somebody trying to see outside, right? So a lot of what I do references windows, in that, again, in talking about this third space where it's like you have a view into something, but you're always separate, right? And one of the things that I learned way too late in my life, just because I felt like it should be a part of the history that's taught, is that only people in steerage went to Ellis Island. If you were, or steerage and second class, if you were in first class, you bypassed that whole experience, right? So you hear a lot of stories about people just wanting to see anything, because they're in the very bottom of the boat in steerage, right? So it's like anytime that you can get fresh air, you do. Anytime you can see something, you do. And then, of course, there's multiple stories of this rush to see the Statue of Liberty, because this is like the thing you've been wanting to see, knowing that you're going to New York City, right? So the positioning of that was very intentional in terms of what would be the spot that I would want to be in order to see this thing. But then I think in terms of the installation work, I think about positioning a lot in terms of access, right? So a lot of the installations that I make are very spatially complicated and allow access only from certain positions. And that's because the nature of the subjects is structures of permission and how we are allowed or denied access based on history, heritage, skin color, passport, religion, all of these structures, these kind of cultural structures that we're either born into or choose, but more of the time born into, right? So I'm really interested in this physical negotiation of space within artwork that then kind of becomes architecture as well, right? And so, and it's funny, the first time, the Letting Go is right now at LAX airport, but the first time I installed it at Cloud and Man, I couldn't make it in my studio because it was too big, and I didn't have the means to mock up a 10-day installation in my studio, right? So the first time I installed it, I thought, oh, this is actually physically almost impossible. So it was like I was having to negotiate these ropes and like trying to squeeze myself inside of these little spaces because I had chosen to weave in this really specific way that was chronological to the life experience of the map that the anchors represented. So it was also interesting that I didn't think about the physical articulation. I thought about the logic of the chronology of my memory. And that's how I have to make this work, right? And then I realized, oh, I'm actually creating spaces that are difficult to navigate, that you're only allowed into a certain spot. And that's now becoming a more increasingly conscious thing that I'm doing as I'm talking about systems of power, really playing with this idea of transparency and access, and, you know, transparency in a very tokenistic way. And then access being very restricted and very limited, and almost like it's like you should be able to do this, but I'm not going to let you, right?
Yes, yeah.
So I'm really interested in how that plays out spatially, and as the works become more architectural and more systemic in how they're formed, I think that's going to continue to play out over time.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, because I was thinking about both of our work, that there's a sense of a presence of us in the work with our positioning, you know, where is this photo taken, or how is this edited, how is this being told? And so our presence is there, even though you don't see us necessarily. And even the stories, maybe you're not seeing the exact person who's speaking, but you get the sense of that person being present, you know. And so there's some access to it. And I feel like, even though there's representation going on, these are actual things being represented. It's like, it's an abstraction too. I feel like our representational work is part of abstraction history, you know, like how do you talk about something that's actually in front of you, but in an abstracted way, to glean from it as much as you can from different perspectives simultaneously, you know? And so I think that's what's so great in Dawn bringing us together and having us talk about that, because I feel that kind of presence in the work of us. And yet I think we're both presenting forms of access. You know, how easy is it to go back to origins, if you even believe that there's an origin, or what that means about that word. And I think when, I'll just use the imprints piece I've been talking about as an example. If you can't get those same people that touch that copper during those shows where they had the ability to walk up to my piece and touch it or do whatever, some of those people are gone. You know, some of them are geographically gone. Some of them, it's, you know, I can't reach them, you know, for whatever reason. And the access to those objects, in this case people, is gone. And it's you know, I think those layers of not getting back to what you want to get back to, or what you think you want to get back to, you know, reflects the stories that we've been talking about our personal lives and moving around so much, being immigrants or products of immigrants, and not getting back to, you know, your grandmother, you know, in another country, not getting back to or waiting. I loved how you phrased it. I'm forgetting how it was exactly, but you said you're waiting to get here. So you spent all this time in England as you're trying to come to this. I mean, that was really fascinating, because then England became like a holding pattern for planes. Like, okay, I want to land, but we're going to circle for 45 minutes, you know? And it was like fascinating. And it's kind of like, oh yeah, there's, the access is not so easy. And then how do you make a viewer sense that lack of access, or that semi-access, or that difficulty of access, at the same time as the person who's telling you that story? You know, when it's, the work is somewhere, at least as I see it, between representation and abstraction. You know, another third space in a sense, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think a part of why your work resonates with me so much, and what I strive to create in my own work, is I think in that third space between representation and abstraction, I hope is where access lives, right? Because ultimately we can only make work from our own experience, from our own knowledge, from our own intellect, right? So whatever kind of work that you make, you as a person is imprinted in that work. And so I think it's like constantly trying to find that balance between being overly explicit or overly abstract. And again, I think this is why these hotel pieces are really resonating with me, is because there's just enough access for me to identify with that experience, or to identify with those moments of intimacy in these transitional spaces. But it's abstract enough that I have space. Like, I have space to put my own narrative in it, and to kind of relate it to my own experience. And so and then that kind of connects me deeply to you as a person, because now we're sharing an experience based on this work that you've presented from these very intimate moments in your life, right? So I think for me, that's really when art is at its best. That's the work that really resonates with me, is where I can fully acknowledge the kind of experience and the will of the author of this work. I also feel invited in. I feel as though like this is being made as an extension of you, as an invitation to me, right? To me, that's when, like, that is the power of really great art, is when that invitation is present. And of course, not everybody is going to respond in the same way, and you know, not everyone is going to like the same things, and that's totally fine. But I think where that invitation is felt and present, and where that feeling of generosity and openness is present, that's the work that I feel like it just cut, like my heart skips a beat when I see it, because I feel like this is made as a way to communicate, and as a way to kind of share experience. And that's, for me, that's that third space that we're talking about, both in terms of culture, and in terms of making, and in terms of sharing space, because there's something very democratic about that third space. Because in that space, I'm not from one place, or live in one place, or, you know, it doesn't have to be so specific, because the third space is the in-between. And regardless of who you are and what your experience is, I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who hasn't at some stage experienced that, right? So that, in some ways, it's like we seek permanence, because I think impermanence is the connector that we're all terrified of.
Yeah. I like your phrase invitation, because I was thinking about how I'm inviting the viewer to be in that bed with me, or in that bed in place of me, to see that experience and see if they can understand what that is. It's a very intimate space to then let someone see how you see. And I feel like in those moments, as we're trying to give someone that invitation, that access to maybe be able to connect with us, it's almost like that human condition where we're kind of saying, oh, do you feel the same way as I do? Do you understand this? Can you be happy with me? Can you be sad with me? Can you be devastated with me about what happened, either to me or my subject, you know, and have them tie to us somehow? Because I think that um, you know, my work is often about, especially this hotel series, about isolation and not having anybody and what that means for a human. Because we're usually pack animals, you know, very few of us are actual hermits. And so to then invite someone in and be like, can you sit with me for a second and see the story? I was so alone. Were you ever that alone? You know? And so I think the only way I could really talk about it to some degree was through the work, through as an artist, through the work, um, and keep it abstract so that maybe someone hears why that happened, but maybe not, because I don't need that hug that we were talking about. No, I don't need a hug. I'm okay.
Yeah.
Just sit by
Yeah.
me, hug me, like, I feel so sorry for you. I'm so, you know. So,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Well, and I'll just add one more thing. What an extraordinary time to be showing this work as
Mhm.
well,
Mhm.
when isolation is a very real thing and
Mhm.
human connection now comes with a sense of danger, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I also think it's really, really important to be sharing this work right now, because while it's something that, you know, many people can relate to
Mhm.
at the best of times, I think especially right now, to have this sort of shared vantage point on
Mhm.
isolation and intimacy feels really important. So I'm really excited that Dawn has chosen these works specifically to share. It feels unfortunately appropriate, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Well,
Good.
thank you so much. I really appreciated this conversation. And I mean, I was thinking of so many other things that we could talk about another time that, but I thought this was a very stimulating conversation. And it also helped me to re-see your work in a different way as well, based on what you told me.
Thank you. Yeah, it was such a pleasure talking to you. And yeah, I feel like I hope there's much more to come, because I was taking notes and I was like, oh, this is another conversation. This is another conversation.
Totally, yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And I